Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, or City of Demons, La La Land, Hollywood, and all these funny things that you want to call it. And of course, we are internationally syndicated, starting with our home base, 107.7 FM UPRN in New Orleans, Louisiana, as well as the Program Radio Network in the UK, with terrestrial station London, Leeds, and elsewhere in the EU. And not to mention iHeartRadio and all these other wonderful ways to listen. And of course, I see all these fine people in chat. Let me give a great shout out to Alan Nakamura for his super chat donation before we even started with this great show. Now, this show has been almost 4 years in the making. If I'm giving you guys a little bit of time here to see if you could see who the guest is by checking out all the social media. I'm going to give you some hints now. In July, or maybe even earlier than that, June of 2015, I brought him on to talk about Project Pegasus. Now that really should give it away. It's the one and only Mr. Andrew Basiago. Andrew, welcome back, dear friend.
It's great to be back, Dr. J.
Now, since we talked about Project Pegasus last time, this time let's talk about the Mars Jump Room program. And actually, not too long after we did the first interview, for the people who are in the chat, if you want to see this video that we did with Third Phase of Moon, we actually went to the Culver City location and filmed outside the building. And I'm assuming that's one of the locations of the jump rooms, right?
No, actually, the West Coast Jump Room was at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California, right south of the Los Angeles International Airport, right across Imperial Avenue, east and west. And in those days, it was sort of a Bauhaus type building with blue walls, blue windows and polished steel siding. But now I think from 2003 forward, they've kind of removed that northern wall and put kind of a California kind of decoupage kind of structure on the front of it. So it really doesn't look like it did in those days. In those days, it looked like any other Bauhaus-inspired metal building with blue windows like we might find, let's say, in the suburbs of Virginia.
Okay, gotcha. Because it definitely looked like it had a facelift when we visited. And I'm glad you corrected me. Thank you for that. It was not obviously Culver City, because I remember the 999 sticking out. That we actually filmed on that corner. Again, it was close to 4 years ago. Now, for those people who are wondering, what exactly is a jump room? Let's talk about that before we talk about the link to Mars.
The jump room was known as an aeronautical repositioning chamber. So the anagram was ARC. And what it was the main elevator in that building, at least for the West Coast jump room, the other jump room being in the CIA complex adjacent to the George Washington Bridge in New York City. But in El Segundo, we would go into the center elevator of the building, and I think on about the 5th floor, we would check in and give our name, our signature, our date of birth, our social security number, and I would also give my UCLA ID number, which was simultaneously my number in the program, 700-414-879. And then we would go up to the 8th floor, which was the top floor of that building, and we would wait for about 5 minutes, and they would be speaking to us through the intercom in the ceiling of the elevator. And then about 5 minutes later, when the lights started flashing inside the elevator would morph from a box-like normal elevator shape into a cylinder. And after about 10 minutes inside the jump room, it would reach its maximum round shape or tunnel-like shape. In fact, we had to sort of hold our hand on the wall of the tunnels to right ourselves, just like when you walk through a water main.
Yes.
And then it would start, after about 10 minutes, it would start correcting itself And about 10 minutes after it started going back into a box-like shape, the far door from where we had entered the elevator would open up, and we were always in a subterranean location on about 7 or 8 different locations on Mars. So we don't know what it was doing. We know that it was a revolutionary technology, and we certainly know who was the actual mastermind in the program. And I also have information linking that individual to extraterrestrial contact. So the Mars jump room story is really critical because it links the hidden history of extraterrestrial contact with U.S. personnel with an aspect of the secret space program that ultimately linked 7 American astronauts. And that's the term I'm now trying to popularize, because those who were brought into the jump room program really weren't treated like astronauts or called astronauts. But we were. And yet the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts have been the focus of all of the news, all of the history writing, all of the documentaries. But, William Whitecrow, one of the jumpers, told me about a year before his death last year that when we were on the surface of Mars, there were often 1,500 fellow Americans.
Wow.
So in a sense, we talk about the secret space program, but wait a minute. The secret space program was the space program. It looks like Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo really did things, and for that matter, the space shuttle program, but they were really more or less the publicity, that they were the information that was being given for public consumption to make the public and even foreign governments and the world believe that that was the extent of the U.S. space program. But it was much more involved. It involved thousands of more people, and it involved landing on celestial bodies in addition to the moon. So I really am started to cringe at the term secret space program, because the secret space program was the space program. It was the actual space program that Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo were used to conceal.
So it's safe to, aside from calling you a chrononaut, which we termed 4 years ago, is to also call you, as these other pilots of Gemini, Apollo, were called astronauts, right?
I can see no reason why we shouldn't call ourselves astronauts, because although we didn't go to space in rockets or space planes, we did go into outer space, and we walked on the surface of the moon. I mean, one of my most vivid memories is I was walking along the surface with Brett Stillings, and we had to get back to one of the jump rooms in time before nightfall, because Mars can grow very cold, even in the equatorial regions, at night. And it wasn't safe for us to stay there at night because of that fact. And I remember looking up at the moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, and then Brett pointed to the Earth on the horizon. And that's one of my most vivid memories of being on Mars and realizing, well, wait a minute. Our feet are on Mars, the moons of Mars are above us, and our planet is way over there. It was just very odd. But, I ultimately connected the accounts of 2 of the Mars jumpers, Michael C. Ralph and Arthur Neumann, with myself and the 4 others I could remember. In other words, I sensed that Michael C. Ralph and Arthur Neumann knew too much about the jump room technology not to have had contact with it. I really believe their accounts. But the 4 that followed me after, about August of 2009, William B. Stillings, Bernard Mendez, William Paris, later known as William Whitecrow, and Ken Johnston, I'm absolutely certain, were on the surface of Mars with me at different times.
Ken Johnston, he's also known as the NASA whistleblower. Is that the same Ken Johnston we're talking about?
The same great man, and in fact, like William Cameron McCool, who was one of the same-aged peers. I think William McCool was 5 days younger than me. I was born on 9/18/61. He was born on 9/23/61. In addition to William Cameron McCool, Ken Johnston belies the covert connection with NASA, because Ken worked extensively with the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. But I encountered him on Mars piloting a craft that we used to call the Sky Taxi. And he would pick us up if we were in danger, like in danger of being attacked by a predator. And we would call him in, and he had this helicopter-like lenticular craft. It was sort of a combination of a helicopter and a flying saucer. And he would land and take us back to one of the jump rooms. So I am absolutely certain that Ken Johnston Sr. was one of the jumpers.
You mentioned predators, and I know we've talked about them off air. For those people that are tuning in, specifically for you being the guest of honor today, can you talk about the predator specific to Mars?
Well, there were two that we were warned about, that if we were anywhere within their proximity, it's likely that we would lose our lives and be eaten by them. The first was a dinosaur-like creature that had the head, sort of a combination of a T-Rex, a Tyrannosaurus Rex type head, with more of a almost like a chicken-like head, but a sort of a supple, smooth, extremely fast velociraptor type body. The other was, it's kind of hard to describe. It looked like a big grasshopper with multiple appendages, maybe 8 to 12 appendages, and it was about the size of a small garbage truck and had saber-like teeth. Now, both of those were extremely dangerous. And in fact, we were trained during our training in 1980 to run in zigzags to try to tire them out if we were anywhere in their proximity. Now, I saw that first type tear apart two of my colleagues.
Ouch.
The first, a 45-year-old guy named Bob, and then a teenager from California named David. I watched both of them be killed by that first type of predator. The second type of predator was behind a rock, and I was using my psychic ability and warning William Stillings. I was saying, Brett, don't go any further. There's something behind that rock. And sure enough, at about 100 feet remove, we looked around the rock, and it was that second type of predator. And we just ran for our lives, and the thing tired. We actually outran it, which was really miraculous. But in the case of Bob and David losing their lives, that was after just exhausting themselves running around in zigzags to try to make the first type of predator lose interest in devouring them. But unfortunately, they lost their lives on the surface. So that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out, not only because so many Americans were on Mars, but the fact that any Americans were on Mars, and that some of us lost our lives. In fact, the first two American astronauts to rocket land on Mars, to crash land on the surface in rockets, there was a communication between our government and the Martian government, the Martian humanoids, who initially agreed to save our personnel, but then they reneged, and those two gentlemen died of exposure on the surface because they had been injured during the crash landing, and they really couldn't fend for themselves, and they died. So, I think we talk so obsessively about Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, particularly now that Neil Armstrong is gone, the experiences of Buzz Aldrin, and that's legitimate to talk about their feats, but I like to emphasize the fact that, wait a minute, most of the Mars jumpers were in their late teens and early 20s. I was going up there from 1981 to 84 when I first was age 19, and then my last jump was when I was age 22. So we were about half the age of, for example, most of the Apollo astronauts. I think that Armstrong and Aldrin were about 39, 40 years old when they landed on the moon on July 20th of 1969, the lunar landing.
Yes.
Okay, so we were about half that age, or at least 20 years younger, and we were going millions of miles farther into space. So I think it's a bit of a sacrilege. It's really unfair, and it's counter-historical to continue after now 35 years to not have validation of the fact that this group of Americans were astronauts. We went into space. We landed on Mars. And in fact, that one of our contemporaries who we were trained with and went with us was Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States. I mean, we've had astronauts as public servants. I think John Glenn, the senator from Ohio, and Bill Nelson, the senator from Florida, are probably the best examples. But it was concealed by President Obama himself when we brought this information forward in 2010 that he was one of the Mars jumpers. And I will stand by that for the rest of my life because it's the truth. So hopefully, now that he's left office, he will keep his promise to us to come forward and acknowledge that he was one of the Mars jumpers.
Now, let me say this. I meant to say this claim earlier that a lot of people who wouldn't know because they're not practicing attorneys such as yourself would understand that the bar, the state bar of which you are associated with, regardless of which state, has ethics. It requires you to go through a tireless ethics to get in. And once you're in, if you were to have any problems, say drugs, alcohol, lying, for instance, you would be disbarred. The fact that you're still a practicing attorney and you've been able to tell these stories and people have been able to question you and the bar still allows you to practice is a big tell sign that, of course, you are not lying.
Correct. And in fact, I'm not only a member of the Washington State Bar Association, I'm a member in good standing also of the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington, which basically deals with federal matters between Seattle and Vancouver, west of the Cascades in Washington State. I have never been challenged. I've never told a lie, and I have never been challenged by my bar associations for making false claims in the public realm, which is certainly below the standard of an attorney. I don't know if they could disbar me if I was to make an untrue claim, but it certainly would be scrutinized because we're supposed to be public servants. And in fact, we took an oath of attorney in which we even agreed to abstain from offensive personality. And unless I hit my thumb with a hammer, I have abstained, for example, from using profanity and vulgarity since I was sworn in on November 15th of 1996. So yes, I take my ethics requirements that the bar imposes very seriously, and I have been telling the truth from the beginning, as were those other individuals I mentioned. I know that Basiago, Stillings, Mendez, Paris, also known as White Crow, which is a metaphysical name that William took later in life, and Ken Johnston are former American astronauts who were on the surface of Mars. I can't say that for sort of the second and third waves of Mars claimants that have come along. I have my opinions. I don't want to name names, but I know that there may be some real experiencers, but there's been kind of a vitiation of the truth movement in the sense that after the unprecedented disclosures, really unheard of prior in the truth movement or in the area of whistleblowers, we had 7 individuals who had served in a secret project who came forward. At least 4 I could validate. But then once the information was disseminated on television and radio and on the internet, I think something else happened, and that is that individuals came along who were either fantasists who were deluded about what we were saying and were attributing our experiences to themselves, which is a known psychiatric condition, and also others were lying. Now, I'm not saying that all who came after us have not gone to Mars. In fact, I've urged the application of a doctrine that I call objectified open-mindedness. What I'm urging is that we don't reach a conclusion of yes or no in terms of believing or not believing. those who came after us, that we should just listen to what they have to say. But I think there's really three types of things going on. There was this unprecedented disclosure, and I think the government panicked that so many people from a classified project were revealing our experiences, especially, I might add, William Whitecrow, because he was a military veteran whose military service could not be denied. In the case of the rest, we were sort of tracked by the military, but not really ultimately military officers. Okay, then there was a group that came along. I know some of them were making up what they were claiming about being on Mars. Some maybe were deluded. Now there's a third group that I really have to listen to because I haven't heard necessarily all of their accounts, and I want to be fair and practice objectified open-mindedness. But I am pretty disturbed that secrecy has prevented the American people from learning this chapter of American experience in space. And then when we came forward, we were attacked, even though we had, like I said, we had gone farther than Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, and at half their ages. So each of us was attacked. For example, Bernard Mendez was attacked by Richard Dolan. I was attacked by Richard Hoagland. And it seemed that every time William Stillings made his very true and realistic comments about Mars, he was attacked as if he was accused of not telling the truth. Now, something very, very awful then happened. When liars and fantasists then followed us, in some cases, when we tried to point out, wait a minute, we know why this person isn't telling the truth, we were then accused of attacking them in the way we had been attacked. So really, the actual American astronauts who went to Mars were attacked coming and going. We were attacked when we talked about our experiences, and then we were attacked for what had happened to us. What had happened to us was attributed to us when we then tried to set the record straight about those who followed us, who weren't engaging in telling the truth of our actual history in space, but I think we're developing almost sort of a new form of science fiction fantasy. I think the analogy is sort of the Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast, where there were people jumping off of bridges in New Jersey because they thought we were being invaded by Martians. So there seemed to be a genre of science fiction that emerged where people began claiming they were in the secret space program. But in a number of prominent cases, I'm able to absolutely prove that they were not true stories, that they were more science fiction fantasy. So I really have to speak out now and really urge the listening audience that, look, we're Americans. These individuals who actually went were astronauts. Would we allow Armstrong and Aldrin to land on the moon and then not only be accused of not going, but have people making up their experiences landing on the moon? I mean, I was never on the moon. I only went to Mars. I don't allege that I was on the moon. And, I was talking to you earlier about the fact that when I was a young man, I had the opportunity to write for Jacques Cousteau's organization. And I wrote a number of articles for Calypso Log and Calypso Dispatch. There was one time during that period where Captain Cousteau was at the Santa Monica offices upstairs, and I didn't go up and meet him, even though Jacques Cousteau was one of my heroes, especially as a child and adolescent. And wouldn't it be wrong for me to say that I sailed aboard the Calypso when what I did was write for the Calypso Log? I mean, it does disservice to history when people make up claims. And I think it's become pandemic in our society because many people have come forward alleging experiences on Mars, often of many years' duration, and yet they haven't provided a single name of who they served with.
Comrades, right?
They haven't stated who their comrades were. And look, the five gentlemen who came forward, Basiago, Stillings, Mendez, Whitecrow, and Johnston, we were able to describe what we did in our training and on the surface, the people, the places, and the events. It wasn't just corroboration of the names. We weren't just saying, well, this is who I served with. we compared our experiences on the air, and even during live appearances where there was no rehearsal. So, for example, in the former Awakening Center in Rainier, Washington, I brought William Stillings in on a large screen and interviewed him, completely impromptu, no rehearsal, no prior knowledge of our discussion. And I also interviewed Bernard Mendez, who flew out from Long Island to Rainier, Washington, and sat with me for about 3 hours and gave a fascinating account of how he was sort of the Indiana Jones of official contact with aliens, and then was placed in the Mars Jump Room program. Now, those who were watching or sitting there live knew without a doubt that we were telling the truth, because there was no way we could have even altered our tone of voice or the cadence by which I was interviewing Brett. I was using techniques from trial practice to repeat what Brett was saying and so forth, and really bring out the information. And everybody present knew we were telling the truth. And we were comrades on Mars, as the later gentleman who came forward. But I think it's kind of conspicuous that after the Mars information became known, a number of individuals have come forward who have alleged multiple years on Mars, but not the name of a single comrade. And I'm sorry, but I find that a threat to validity.
I've heard some up to 60 years, if I'm not mistaken. Is that one of the time frames you've also heard?
One of the claimants alleges 20 years and back. Now, look, I'm 57. In 3 years, I will be 60. I remember the names of individuals not only that I was in kindergarten with at age 4, but that I was playing with at age 2 and 3 in my neighborhood, like Joey Harris, like Billy Harris, like Roger Markey, okay, if they're listening. And yet these individuals who are alleging, well, one individual is alleging 60 years in the secret space program. He has mentioned a handler, but he hasn't shared even the name of any of his comrades. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. In 60 years of experience, wouldn't one remember some of the names of one's comrades and friends? So I think those are threats to validity, and yet the public has been gullible and has believed individuals who have very little information to prove what they've been alleging.
One of the titles that, I don't know if it was Alfred Webre who told you, maybe correct me if I'm wrong on this part, said that you would have the equivalent rank of, was it Lieutenant Commander, but that would be the equivalent had you been in the U.S. military? Was that right?
No, how that developed is I was told by two individuals affiliated with the program, Courtney Hunt of the CIA, Courtney Maurice Hunt of the CIA, career CIA officer, and Dr. Eldon Byrd, who was one of the top civilian scientists for the Navy. Eldon had worked on the Trident nuclear missile program. I was told in the 1980s the 80s by Hunt and the 90s by Eldon, that I had reached the rank of Lieutenant Commander in the Navy when I earned my law degree in 1991. Now then, my friend and colleague and one of the great exopolitical writers, Alfred Lambremont Webre, began to call me Lieutenant Commander Andrew D. Basiago of the United States Navy, but I urged him to stop doing so because I was never commissioned as an officer. And, you know, it's dangerous to claim that you have military rank or service that you don't have, because there's a congressional enactment that prohibits it. It violates federal law. It's known as the Stolen Valor Act. So I urged Alfred strenuously to stop calling me Lieutenant Commander Andrew D. Basiago of the U.S. Navy, because even though I was being tracked by the Navy, and I did carry the badge of the Naval Investigative Service in a policing action that I was part of after I left the jump room program, I was never commissioned as a naval officer. I was only photographed once, in fact, in the dress whites of a naval officer, and that was at the Long Beach Naval Station's quartermaster office in October of 1981. And that was it. So I have no medals or certificates to prove that I was reached that rank in the Navy. And I would discourage those who are alleging military service that they do not possess as an officer or an enlisted man, because it violates federal law, and they could do jail time of multiple years.
It's felony.
If they do so.
Right?
It's a felony. It's a federal felony. And so it's a dangerous game to be alleging that one was an officer in one of the ranks of service when one, in fact, was not.
Let me ask you about the Martian government that you said that originally had a sort of a treaty, per se, with the U.S. government or the Earth governments, that if any of human soldiers, or not soldiers, human astronauts were to be injured or crash, that the government, the local government, the Mars, would protect them. Can you describe what the people on Mars look like?
Well, there were two types of humanoids. One looked very much like us. When I saw three of them at an air base in New Jersey in summer of 1970, when they were leaving from a liaison mission with some of our aerospace personnel, including my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, they looked essentially like tall, bald, rugged men, kind of like, well, let's say in acting, I would say Telly Savalas. In politics, I would say maybe Jesse Ventura, Governor Jesse Ventura. They were bald, sort of ruggedly handsome men. And yet when they walked away from me, the allocation of their muscles in their upper body was in a different location. Now, those were the descendants of the humans from Earth who were on Mars in antiquity. Part of the Mars story that's been concealed is that during the Egyptian civilization, the high Egyptian civilization of the pharaohs, under Akhenaten and Nefertiti, we reached out and we put human personnel on the moon, Mars, and planetoids or moons like Iapetus, the moon of Jupiter, and Enceladus, the moon of Saturn. So our solar system was explored and it was colonized. That's why they called Akhenaten the sun god. And there was a solar system catastrophe in 9500 BC where the Earth and the Moon and the Mars were hit by debris from space, and Mars was essentially turned into what Richard Hoagland has quite accurately described it as being, a vast, muddy wasteland. Life on Earth, and animal and vegetable, was a lot better recovering from that solar system catastrophe. That was around 11,500 years ago. And so that first group of Martians, the one we call Homo Martis Terris, for Earthman on Mars, are essentially our cousins. And in fact, at only about 11,500 years removed, they probably can reproduce with us in the way that, let's say, somebody who's of Swedish extraction can impregnate, an Australian Aborigine. We're all members of the same race on Earth. There's just differences of ethnicity, but there's only one race. And that was proven when we mapped all the different phenotypes around the world, and there's just slight gradations as you go all the way around the world. Now, so that group are essentially our cousins on Mars. The other group were the humanoids that were there when they got there in antiquity. We call those Homo Martis Martis for Martian man on Mars. And they are smaller than us. They have long faces, pointy ears, and spindly bodies, long fingers. And some of the males have antennae out of the forehead that are sort of prehensile sensing devices that can both smell and pick up vibrations and things. It's just another sense organ. I think the closest picture I've been able to find to the Homo Martis Martis is the picture of Max Schrank in the 1922 German horror classic Nosferatu. Remember that actor,
Yes.
Max Schrank? He played Count Orlok, a vampire, in Nosferatu. They had that haunted sort of look about them. And in fact, they were highly intelligent. One day, Courtney Hunt of the CIA and I were greeted by this elderly Homo Martis Martis, and he was walking very fast in front of us to try to show us where he was living, his underground residence. And he was looking back at me sort of like Marty Feldman in Young Frankenstein. He was very sort of haunted and recondite in his personality. So that was, in general, the personality of the Homo Martis Martis if they were a considerable age. But their young individuals, both their young adults and especially their children, were extremely cute. They sort of looked like Tibetan or Chinese children and adolescents in long black, white, and sky blue caftans. In fact, I think the caftans of Asia and the Near East were introduced to this planet from Mars, because I saw so many of those walking through this dilapidated brick city that the Homo Martis Martis were using to observe me, that they looked, and then they looked rather Tibetan. So I think there was some admixture of Martian blood that influenced some of the Asiatic people and some of the European people. In fact, I learned in the program that those of us who were being sent had to be from one of the 7 root races that Ignatius Donnelly talked about in his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The 7 root races of the Indo-European people: the Celtic, the Slavic, the Germanic, the Italic, the Greek, the Persian, and the Indian. That is the West Indian, the Indians of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. Those ethnicities, I don't like the term races, but those root ethnicities of the Indo-Europeans have Martian blood. From the time in antiquity when we were part of a 3-planet confederation. It was Earth, Mars, and another planet that was destroyed. So there are many of us walking the streets of America who have Martian blood. And I think the people have a right to know this, that they don't just have Earthian blood, but Martian blood in some cases.
One of the metals the metal that you were promised was the space metal, and you have never received it, right?
Right. What happened is I went up one time in the space elevator with Bernard Mendez. It fragmented. We were rolled across the surface, this very rocky surface where we had to pull the rocks out of our body, small pebbles. But the wind was howling. And I had a stress reaction. I don't like to valorize my experience or that of other astronauts because space is a scary place to be sometimes. We have to be real about that. Those who will go into space in the next several generations need to know that sometimes it's kind of scary to be so far away from our Earth, Mother Earth, as we call it. And so I kind of was in a stress reaction, and Bernard Mendez grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Andy, get a hold of yourself. I know where we are. I'll get us out of here. Follow me." And I followed Bernard around several mountains, and then I could see the jump room called the Corkscrew in the distance. It was about a mile away. And right after Bernard pointed to it and said, "Look, Andy, we know where we are," he collapsed in a dead heat. Just fell forward in a faint, just really hard, so hard that his feet actually flipped up behind him. He hit his stomach that hard on the ground. And I went over and rolled him over and checked his breathing and his heart and determined that he was alive. But I knew if I left him there unconscious, he might be eaten by any one of those predators. In fact, there were 5 or 6 carnivores on Mars. So those were just the most dangerous predators, but there were other predators that could have come along and eaten him if I left an unconscious astronaut on the surface. So I did a fireman's carry, and I was 180 pounds at the time, about 20 years old. Bernard was about 35 years old and 160 pounds. I was about 5'10", he was about 5'8". And I did a fireman's carry, and I had to drop him on the ground about 3 times as I walked him into the jump room that we called the Corkscrew because of its conch shell type shape. And I finally came in, pushing at, walking along in oxygen that's about what oxygen levels are on Earth at the 12,000 to 14,000 foot level on Mount Everest, and I was just pancaked almost down to the ground, trying to bring him into the room, into the jump room facility. And I dropped him in the elevator and said, I don't know if he's still alive, but get him home. And Bernard ended up waking up in a hospital in Los Angeles, probably Daniel Freeman Memorial near Marina del Rey, because that was the closest to the El Segundo West Coast jump room site. And I was told by both Courtney Hunt of the CIA and Eldon Byrd that for that valor I had received the Space Medal of Honor. I know that William Stillings was also told by Courtney Hunt that as a result of his feats of going up to Mars when he was only first 14 years old and interacting as extensively as he did with the Martian humanoids, even hosting some of them when they came to Earth in the other direction through the Mars jump rooms on Mars, and coming to our Los Angeles, that Brett had also been awarded with the Space Medal of Honor. But guess what we have to show for that? Nothing. We don't have the medal. We don't have a certificate. We don't have a letter from the Secretary of the Navy, for example. So this is one of the reasons I'm speaking out. American astronauts distinguished themselves on the surface of Mars, and yet secrecy has prevented us from even claiming our medals. And I think that's wrong. I think that's un-American. And I'm going to be asking President Trump to correct that. I mean, if we're going to be great again, as President Trump has called for, I think being great again involves giving medals, space medals of honor, to those who earned them. And that's America, right? That's what America's supposed to be about.
That's why Buzz Aldrin was present when he gave the State of the Union this past couple of months ago.
Well, Buzz greeted William Stillings and I and our fathers, Thomas J. Stillings of Lockheed Skunk Works and Raymond F. Basiago of Parsons Corporation, two of the defense contractors that, in addition to Hughes aircraft, were behind the jump room program. Buzz greeted us the day before our training in August of 1980. He was present at the campground on the north shore of Lake Siskiyou, and we were camping there, Brett with his father and I with my father, and we walked over there, and Brett and I were stunned when Buzz stepped between two vehicles and said, "Andy, Brett, pleased to meet you. Well, let me tell you, fellas, you're going to be doing something in a little while that I did a little while back, and that's go off planet. Let me tell you, boys, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime." So Buzz actually greeted us before our Mars training class began under Major Ed Dames at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. Initially for several days there in August of 1980, we met at the auxiliary building for College of the Siskiyous in Wairika, California. And then several days later, we moved over to the main campus for College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. So Buzz Aldrin had to know about the existence of the Mars jump room program and that we were sending American teenagers there. And that's, I think, what one of his astronaut colleagues meant when he said Buzz wants to go back to Mars. I think that was Eugene Deke Slayton. Deke Slayton said that twice on a CNN broadcast and an MSNBC broadcast, that Buzz wants to go back to Mars. And it was sort of laughed off as a faux pas on Deke Slayton's part, but in fact I think Deke slipped up and told the truth. Because everybody affiliated with the Mars jump room program, including Ed Dames, well, in fact, Ed Dames told us when he was teaching us that everybody affiliated with the program had to go to Mars at least once. That was the engineers, the young people involved, their training officers, and so forth. So in all likelihood, in addition to stepping on the moon, Edwin Aldrin has stepped on Mars. And I think that in a similar way that all of us were brainwashed to forget, I think in the case of Buzz Aldrin and Ken Johnston, they made them want to go to Mars even though they had gone to Mars. And that shows just the ability to block memory and then brainwash individuals that the CIA had by the 1980s. I strongly suspect that Buzz went to Mars, and that explains Deke Slayton's comment.
That's why he would say go back to. Obviously, if he was going back to, it would infer that he'd been there before.
You can't go back to a planet you've never been on, right?
That's right.
So that's pretty clear. And I didn't meet Buzz on the surface, but we did meet him, as I said, one day before our training program. So that was about Sunday, August 18th or so of 1980. And then that Monday we went into training at College of the Siskiyous. So since Buzz knew where we were going, he knew it was Mars connected. So if the pattern of all the others that I had any affiliation with during those years connected to the program involved them going there, in all likelihood Buzz went to Mars and then was brainwashed to believe that he wanted to go there. And I think Ken's now breaking through to a lot of his memories, but I think Ken was given similar programming. That is, to want to go even though he had gone. And isn't that clever on the part of the CIA and NASA?
Now, the CIA, as most people see in spy movies, see the CIA is behind things that happen in the United States, when technically the CIA can't operate within domestic borders without a domestic agency attached. Now, I would think because it's not on the U.S. territory, that's probably why I'm assuming the CIA would be involved. Is that why you were told they were involved?
I was never really told why the CIA was involved. I mean, DARPA was the lead agency on Project Pegasus when I was a child, the U.S. time-space program at the time of the emergence of time travel. But I think the CIA was involved because the mastermind of the jump room program was without question Howard Hughes. And I think I'd like to talk about Hughes to some extent. But
yeah. Thank you for opening that door, because that's actually what I was going to ask you when you mentioned Hughes Aircraft being involved with the technology.
Right. I think that Hughes Aircraft, Parsons, and Lockheed Skunk Works needed to affiliate with a certain agency, and since they were going to be collecting so much fascinating information about Mars, I think they partnered with CIA. I don't know exactly why CIA was the lead agency on the jump room program beyond that, because there was really very little CIA involvement. You know, my father, for example, was a Defense Department engineer who, while he had reporting requirements to the CIA and other agencies during his life, and while when I contacted the CIA after his death, I found that they couldn't release information to the family members of living or deceased CIA personnel, meaning that my father was in the CIA employee records. You know, as I mentioned, Brett's father, Tom, was at Lockheed Skunk Works, and Hughes Aircraft was definitely implicated because who had offices on the fourth floor of the building there in El Segundo at 999 North Sepulveda when we were taking the 8th floor to Mars? None other than Howard Robart Hughes. Now, he was supposed to have died in spring of 1976 en route to Houston. And everybody was given that story about how he had allowed his hair and fingernails to grow, and he was obsessively watching Ice Station Zebra while eating black walnut ice cream and putting tissues everything to avoid germs. That was not Howard Hughes. That was one of his doubles. Instead, his death was faked in 1976 to protect Howard Hughes from abduction or assassination while he worked on sensitive defense technical projects connected to the CIA. That may be, by the way, the CIA connection. One of those was the so-called Glomar Explorer. That was a submersible that was invented by Hughes Aircraft and Howard Hughes to pick a Soviet submarine off the floor of the Pacific Ocean after it had a disaster and all the personnel aboard were drowned. And they wanted to get hold of a Soviet sub so we could make sure that we stayed ahead of their technology. And that mission was a success. But what was not told by the popular press about the latter days of Howard Hughes is he was the mastermind behind the Mars Jump Room program. And this is where I really want to tie together Hughes, the Jump Room program, and extraterrestrialism. Because when I was practicing law, when I began practicing law in Washington State, I had a client who shall remain partly nameless. Her name was Rose M., as in Mary, but I'm out of courtesy to her, I won't reveal her full name. And Rose told me that when she was a secretary for Howard Hughes at the El Segundo, California headquarters building of Hughes Aircraft, one day before leaving for lunch, Howard Hughes came to her desk and said, "Rose, two gentlemen are going to be coming to your desk when I'm at lunch. They're going to be giving you some parts for me, some aerospace parts. They're not from this planet, but they look just like us. Please be on your best behavior and be as polite as possible to them, and please thank them on my behalf for the parts they're going to leave with me." Now that indicates that Hughes, and I believe it was a true story by Rose, one of my law clients who had no reason at that point, didn't even know about my Mars Jump Room experience. She just volunteered it when I was actually doing her estate plan and investigating a crime against her and her granddaughter and daughter. They were beat up by a neighbor, and they thought they could sue their apartment complex. So Rose was telling me the truth. Okay, that means that Hughes was an extraterrestrial liaison before the Mars Jump Room program was under his direction. So I suspect he was the conduit between the Martian humanoids and us in creating a rapid way to reach Mars, probably with their technology, because they were about 10 years ahead of our Aurora spacecraft.
Can you talk about the technology that was used in these jump rooms?
I have no knowledge of what it was, and in fact, I've discouraged the use of the phrase "the teleporters to Mars," or that we reach the Martian surface via teleportation. I think it might have been a form of exoplanetary chronovision. The chronovisors on Project Pegasus, of course, were electro-optical devices where they found when they put an electromagnetic signal through an 8-sided bismuth crystal. Bismuth is element 83. A hologram of a past or future event popped out on the stage. I think that the Mars Jump Room may have been a form of exoplanetary chronovision because we were getting there so fast, 20 minutes, even though it was millions of miles away. And because one time when I had my arm ripped off, when I was interviewed by Bernard Mendez and Ed Dames back in El Segundo, in a subterranean debriefing room that existed there across on the northern side of that building, my arm was reattached. And there were other instances where individuals who were killed or maimed on the surface would report to the jump room facilities on Mars completely intact. Alive if they had been dead, and intact if they had been dismembered in some way, as I was when my arm was ripped off. I still have, by the way, bursitis in my upper right arm from that event. So something was going on that wasn't just mere space travel. I suspect that we were going to the real Mars, but we were going there in a form of holography rather than space travel per se. But we were definitely there. And, you know, when William Stillings first landed on Mars, he bent down and tasted the sand and said, "Yep, we're really here." And I'm thinking, man, if they simulated that through virtual reality, I don't think they could have fabricated the Mars that we interacted with. The smell, the appearance, the way that the moons of Mars looked in the sky. I don't think they had virtual reality at that time to synthesize what we were experiencing. But I do think it's possible that Howard Hughes had somehow figured out a way to project chronovision into space to insert us onto the planet, but in a holographic way.
This sounds much like the Project Yellow Book, which was exactly as you mentioned with the chronovision, where a hologram would appear, and depending on your emotions, it would reflect the future. And because your emotions would fluctuate, as would your feelings, there would be a change in each time you would use the yellow book. And the reason why it was also called yellow book was because the hologram itself had a yellow tint. Were you familiar with this at all?
Well, when I was a child on Pegasus, we had in fall of 1971, when we were starting the 5th grade, we were visiting an Exxon night school over in Convent Station, New Jersey, where we were being given our so-called Yellow Book lessons. The Yellow Book, in fact, was a book about the origins of the universe and the origins of Earth, written by a gray extraterrestrial who came to Earth after the Roswell incident to collect the bodies of his fellows, of his deceased comrades who had crash landed on Earth on July 7th of 1947. That individual was a guest of our government for a number of years, and he was asked by the government to write his understanding of the origin of the universe and life in the universe and life on Earth, and he did. And that was the Yellow Book. But we have to remember that chronovision emerged from both extraterrestrial and very terrestrial sources. Chronovision was not only in the possession of the small and the tall grays, but it was developed by the Vatican priests Pellegrino Ernetti and Agostino Gemelli, also known as Pier Maria Gemelli when he became a priest, at the Vatican College in Milan in the 1940s. So that was confirmed for me when Father Ernetti came to the chronovisor location in Morristown, New Jersey, again in 1971, coincidentally, when I was on the project, and I saw Father Pellegrino Ernetti at Morristown. So there was both an extraterrestrial and a Vatican provenance for chronovision. And I can see where the Yellow Book might have referenced it, although I don't remember it being something that the ET talked about, but very well could have been in the sense that we were given our Yellow Book lessons right before being introduced to chronovision or shortly thereafter.
I'm very glad that you actually mentioned the fact that the extraterrestrial came back to collect the deceased bodies, because that's what Clifford Stone said would happen during each of the crash and retrievals, that there would be the fellow, whether you want to call them race or whatever, other extraterrestrials that would come back to get them, and sometimes the actual crash ship, so it wouldn't be in the possession of us, even though humanity has had multiple ships. Some people estimate up to 200 even.
Oh, yes. And Clifford, by the way, didn't believe me, either my time travel account or my Mars jump room account. And in fact, the reason is he had a uniform, he had medals, he had certificates to show what he did, but we were intentionally given nothing to prove what we did. But I am, in fact, a former American chrononaut and former American astronaut, and I forgive Clifford just as I forgive other skeptics. But, hey, we served, and I'm going to continue to tell the truth. We served. As I said, I don't know about every claimant, but I know about the ones that I mentioned.
It sounds to me like they wanted you to have plausible deniability, or for them to have plausible deniability, by giving you nothing to be able to verify anything other than having comrades.
Exactly. And it was really a miracle that those 5 came together. I think the person who's to be initially credited, in fact, is William Stillings. Because when Brett came to me in April-May timeframe of 2010, I had already done Coast to Coast and talked about my my time travel experiences in Project Pegasus, but I was still blocked about my Mars experiences. So, for example, when I wrote my landmark paper about life forms, both humanoid and animal, in NASA Image PIA 10214, in my acclaimed paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, the reason I was treating it as the discovery of life on Mars is because I was totally blocked at that point about our experiences on Mars or even our training. And it was during our training, when we were studying the animals and humanoids on Mars, that Ed Dames said, and guess which one of us publishes the paper and reveals all this? And he walked into the aisles of our classroom and stood next to me and said, Andy, ta-da! And I was kind of embarrassed because he was predicting what would happen in the future, because the CIA, of course, was in possession of quantum access as a result of Project Pegasus. So I had even forgotten about our training and the fact that the future paper I would write, 28 years later in 2008, was discussed when we had our 3-day review of the animals and humanoids on the surface. So if Brett had not contacted me in spring of 2010, I think it's very unlikely that I would have broken through the memory blocks that they put in my mind to the Mars experiences. But at this point, I remember everything. I remember our training. I remember going up in the space elevator. I remember, the ARC, the aeronautical repositioning chambers. I remember always being debriefed by Ed Dames when I would be back in the building in El Segundo. He would then put a device on our heads that he described as the American reverse-engineered version of the Soviet LIDA machine, L-I-D-A, which creates all this noise and rock and roll music and stuff, and while you're being talked to forget what you just experienced. So we were subject to the electronic dissolution of memory, but guess what? It didn't work. In fact, the only way to block memory, as distinguished from learning, memory is everything that happens to us. The only way to take that out is to remove a portion of the brain, let's say during surgery for a tumor.
Like a lobotomy, essentially.
But everything we experience is remembered forever. What we learn is what we're able to recover from memory. But up there in our engrams of our brain is everything that has ever happened to us. And when I started talking with William Stillings and Bernard Mendez in long Skype sessions, long into the morning, man, we really brought it forward so that we were able to talk about specific instances when William Whitecrow and Ken Johnston came forward. The story, for example, that Chris Hardwick made fun of on Comedy Central, I think his show was called After Midnight, about the pterodactyl-like predator attack from the sky that William Whitecrow and I fended off with automatic weapons. That happened. So think about that. American astronauts go millions of miles to Earth, and they even exercise valor by protecting each other with automatic weapons from predators on the surface, and it was reduced to cheap comedy at night. I don't think we would have done that to Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins for landing on the moon. And that is how the Mars jump room has been treated. And I have to use that word again. That is a sacrilege. We are America. We are proud of our astronauts. We are justifiably proud of the phenomenally brilliant engineers and scientists like Howard Hughes, like my father, like Brett's father, Tom Stillings, who enabled us to get millions of miles into space through a technology that has not yet even been declassified. We don't know what it was. We don't know how they were doing it. There's even a dispute among the jumpers, and I kind of touched upon it already, that were we going to the actual Mars? Were we going to a hologram of the actual Mars? Or were we going to what Bernard Mendez described, that I then named the idea of a synthetic quantum environment, some other planetoid that they had confused for Mars? Bernard described how the Apollo astronauts called them folds in space. We don't know, but we know we were off planet, and we know we were trained for Mars, and that during those 4 years that I was going, or 3 years that I was going, 1981 to 1984, we had every understanding that it was the actual Mars. And I mentioned, looking up at the moons, Phobos and Deimos, up in the sky one time at dusk, and I believe it was the actual Mars.
I would imagine if you're on Mars and you're able to see the Earth as the way we are able to see the moon right now, or is it even possible because of the distance? Because even now, with the naked eye, you can't see the Mars nearly as clearly as you could see something as close as the moon.
Correct. It was a tiny little speck. We're just lucky to see it. But yes, I saw Earth from Mars. I didn't see the clouds and formations on the Earth. I just saw a tiny little speck when Brett pointed out one day.
Are you open for questions? Because a lot have piled up in the chat.
Absolutely. I love talking about this program because, again, it was an unprecedented breakthrough when all 5 of those individuals who worked with each other on Mars came forward. And I don't want it to be diminished by the attacks that were made when we came forward and then the fakery that followed. So I really want to continue to keep on talking about it, and I'm absolutely welcome the questions from your audience.
And as Pam Brettenberg, my social media manager, said in the chat, everybody who's writing questions, please put them in caps so I could separate them from the comments. And I'm going to go in reverse order since the questions have been piling up since the beginning, and I'm only able to see the most recent. So let me start with here. Helidiumlabs.com asks, what question does he have on the things he has? I don't know if you can make that out, but that's word for word what it says.
I don't understand the question. What questions do I have on the things I have?
Yeah, that's what it says. Maybe Helidium Lab, maybe you could rewrite that question. Let me go on. Okay, let's see here. Lasha Senyak. She was wishing you would talk more about the event and describe the things that you had dealt with on Mars.
Well, mostly we were going up there to create an extraterrestrial defense regime. That was the first goal. The second was to have both lifers who were living there permanently. They must have been from prisons and military prisons at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I never learned where they were from. But there were some men living in rudimentary hovels on the surface, little shacks made out of stone, who were lifers. We were the so-called VIPs. And although some of us were future American leaders, like Barack Obama and I and Regina Dugan, what they meant by VIP is we were just very important people who were lucky enough to just go for short times on Mars and then come back. So we would go for minutes, hours. One time I was there, I had to sleep there with Courtney Hunt and William Stillings, but we were going for short hops. And we were going there to ultimately, believe it or not, they wanted to claim Mars as U.S. territory, even though I later learned that violated the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. But they were trying to create a basis to claim Mars as U.S. territory by having people live there, but also having people going back and forth. I was in the group that was going back and forth, so we could assert the same kind of sovereignty over Mars that different countries claimed, let's say, over Antarctica. Okay. Now, while I was there doing that and we were exploring the surface, I ultimately received a task, just as Barack Obama did, to take information to American personnel who were posted on the surface in telecommunication centers. So I became sort of an errand. Before going over to El Segundo, I would go to Santa Monica to a print shop where the CI personnel would hand me a disc, one of those 3.5 or 3 1/4 inch discs that we called floppies, even though they were kind of plastic and rigid. And I would take that information with me when I jumped to Mars, and I would walk through this dilapidated brick city and hand it to an American telecommunications officer. He never said anything. It was amazing. I'd always just say hello to him and hand him the disc and then walk home. So we had some basic tasks after a certain amount of exposure on the surface, but initially we were supposed to just go up there and walk around. As Ed Dames said during our training, it was to acclimate the Martian humanoids and animals to our very earthling presence on the surface. And he said, so do you understand what I'm asking of you? Your task is to be seen and not eaten, which kind of solicited uncomfortable laughter from those teenagers present. But we were really just up there to establish the fact that Americans were visiting from Earth, and that formed the basis to claim Mars as U.S. territory.
One Stoner Two Cats asks, "What are tesseracts real, and have you ever used one?"
Did he say tesseract?
Yeah, tesseract. T-E-S-S-E-R-A-C-T.
They're real in the, yes, they're real in the sense that the technical term for the Tesla teleporters was Tesla Energetic Array. And when Madeleine L'Engle wrote A Wrinkle in Time, that Newbery Award-winning children's classic about time travel, when I read that book and took it to my dad and pointed out some of the coincidences, that the Tesla Energetic Array could be the Tesseract, that, C.W. Charles Wallace, the protagonist of the story, that matched Curtis Wright, which is where the teleporter was in New Jersey, and then the children fly away at the end of the novel on a white Pegasus. My dad said, yeah, I know. That's called disinformation. And the CIA had Madeleine L'Engle plant those elements in her book to confuse the public and other world governments about the fact that we had devices called Tesla energetic arrays through which we were teleporting back and forth across the country. By 1970, I first jumped to New Mexico as a 6-year-old in the winter of 1968. So, yes, there were tesseracts in the sense that there were Tesla energetic arrays, but tesseract is an artifact from Madeleine L'Engle's novel, which was, in fact, disinformation.
Mr. Pritchard, that's the username. Could they have been using some type of virtual reality then?
No, I don't believe it was a virtual reality because I've tracked the history of virtual reality, and there is no way they could have mirrored us walking on the surface, Brett being able to taste the sand on the ground, seeing our colleagues' guts ripped apart in front of us, looked up in a darkening sky and seen the perfect semblance and craters of Phobos and Deimos. It just surpassed virtual reality at that time. And we were, make no mistake, we were trained to know that we were going somewhere. In fact, Barack Obama, when I met Barack Obama in our training, we were walking out of class that afternoon, and I introduced myself, and he said, you know, man, we're really doing something that few human beings have done. And I said, and that is step on another planet. And I said, I know. I keep on imagining the fact that we're going to have our feet on Mars, and Earth is going to be above our head if we're even able to see it. And so we were trained and in no way deceived. This was not some kind of psychological experiment. We really went. And we signed actually, we signed our last will and testaments and things like that before going up there. It was a serious undertaking, and it involved high danger and high valor by those young people going. But, we bucked up and we dealt with it. And that's one of the reasons also I'm speaking out. I want today's 18-year-olds and 22-year-olds and 25-year-olds and 30-year-olds to know that, look, this was a group of American kids in their late teens, and also adults went up, by the way. I mean, on my last jump in May of '84, my father went up. I think Brett's father also was up with us once or twice. So I want, young people in America to know that, we went into space and we dealt with it, and we explored the surface of Mars. And they will too. They will go into space. And it's a wonderful experience to go out into the cosmos and then come back to our incredibly beautiful and environmentally rich planet. And we need to protect it. I was left with that impression, even though we didn't see Earth because we couldn't look outside the jump room. But I then went on to become an environmental lawyer and planner and writer. And I really think that if we could all have that experience, we'd realize just how incredibly beautiful and important this planet is.
Nicholas Cashmore, are there megaliths on Mars?
Oh, yes. There are shallow pyramids. There are many signs and different forms of artwork that one of the two Martian humanoid species, I never figured out which, have made. In fact, some of them, you can look past one statue at a second and third statue behind it, and it spells something out. But one of the things I noticed about most of the statues that dot the Martian surface is they either had a reptilian or a mammalian motif to them, and I think that signaled which areas of the surface were safe. And I do remember Ed Dames telling us in our training that the CIA had concluded that most of the Martian statues are basically a form of signage to tell those coming after them that this area was either safe or unsafe for predators, for example.
Like the face on Mars, for instance?
Well, the face on Mars is huge, and it may be, I don't know, it could be the face of Akhenaten for all I know, but it's been damaged by asteroid strikes or by explosions. So the nose is kind of blown off, but still slightly there. So it's the face of a humanoid that's been damaged. But I like to say that, look, there's not one face on Mars, just at Cydonia. Making both statues and profiles and signage of the heads, the faces, the profiles of simians is essentially the dominant Martian art form. You have to look no further than Tsiolkovsky Ridge, as described in my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, where I present a panel of about 20 different heads and faces that are on the surface there. So for some reason, the Martians just have been inspired to just make faces a lot. And they are of humanoids, they are of ape-like creatures, of Sasquatch-like creatures, and not just the heads, but masks and faces and profiles. So it just seems to be the dominant public art form there.
Before I ask the next question, let me just tell everybody out there who's listening, especially in the chat, again, please remember to put your questions in caps, as I see many of you are doing. But for those of you who haven't done, please copy and repaste your questions on the bottom so I can see them, as opposed to sifting through the comments. Let me let you finish, Andy, before I ask you the next one.
Sure. Well, I was just saying that we saw a lot of the artwork, but it's only in some places. So there's large areas of Mars that are vacant of almost anything. I mean, you know, I've described how Mars is in some places the color of, let's say, Sedona, Arizona. It's that rich rust red. But there's other soils that are sand-colored, brown, and sort of pod soils. But if I've ever stepped in an area of Mars, or excuse me, an area of Earth that's like Mars, that would probably be the kind of that gumbo soil you get in some lake areas like Pyramid Lake in California, or Castaic Lake. There's large areas of Mars that are just basically just, like I said, Richard Hoagland's description of a vast muddy wasteland really describes it. There were periods where we would just be trenching through just vast fields of nothing but mud. And the planet surface is almost devoid of vegetation, but there is vegetation in certain areas. Like one of the jump rooms let us off in an area that looks sort of like the high desert of California with smaller cactus. So Mars is not devoid of vegetation, but it largely is. In most areas, it just has small little grasses and worts. So we were seriously deprived of oxygen. And one time on the surface, after we returned, I asked Courtney Hunt of the CIA, who was going up with us many times, Courtney, how are we breathing on a planet almost devoid of vegetation? And he said, the lithosphere. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, we know that the rocks are leaching oxygen. So that's why we had that oxygen of, let's say, the density of 12,000 or 14,000 feet on Earth. But it was really difficult to breathe. And in fact, one time I had a a hyperventilation attack just trying to breathe. And I had a discussion through one of the handlers through my helmet. I don't know whether he was on Mars or on Earth, saying, "Okay, Andy, what's going on?" I said, "I can't catch my breath," because it was really, really deficient in oxygen, but yet breathable.
At the altitude, as you mentioned, like Earth, 12 to 14,000 feet, at the higher when I skydive, for instance, then the ceiling that usually you could jump without oxygen tends to be about 12 to 13, sometimes 14,000 feet. It's about the 15,000 feet level and above where if you don't have oxygen, you will pass out with hypoxia. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And also the fact that you just mentioned or addressed the vegetation. This goes back to a question that was written probably about an hour ago about what do the predators or other animals that live on Mars, what do they survive on? Vegetation, which essentially is what you mentioned. So I'm glad you did.
Well, no, actually, we were told that the five or six of the 30 or so major land animals were predators. They were attacking other animals for meat. They were carnivores, yes. Now, there was one that was a saprophyte, namely it was surviving on the waste, the solid waste of other predators. And then there were predators that were smaller and not so much relying on meat, but I think probably also able to eat the grasses and the worts and the sedges, but man, not a lot of it. So most of the nutrient cycling of the animals on Mars is by eating other animals. I think the analogy is to that island off of Mexico that Captain Cousteau did a documentary about, Clipperton Island, where some of the species were eating members of their own species. It's pretty desperate up there, and in fact, we were warned to watch out for that second group of humanoids, the original Martians, the Homo martis martis, because occasionally they were jumping and killing one of our fellow astronauts and barbecuing them.
Jeez.
For food. That's how desperate their need for meat was. Other times we would see them come up to the surface and kill one of the wildebeest type animals or water buffalo type animals and then drag it home. So Mars is not a happy place to live. And in fact, some of them want to come here, I was told. Some of the Homo martis and the Homo martis terris, because life on Earth is a picnic compared to life on Mars. It is a desperate quest for food there that they often do not win.
Especially very, if they're resulting to a form of cannibalism, that desperately sounds like they need food, like you mentioned.
Well, I think they viewed us as a different species, so they thought they could eat us. But I was told that several American astronauts were actually killed and eaten by fellow humanoids on Mars, and that was the Homo martis martis, and so that when I was walking past them, just to kind of watch myself, take off in a gallop if they made any attempt to knock me out or cannibalize me. So it's pretty scary walking past the Homo martis martis. Although the one that gave us the tour of his underground residence, to Courtney Hunt and I, did nothing to threaten us. He was quite hospitable.
Swampy McGee asks, which defense contractor, what, where, when, and why?
The three defense contractors involved in the Mars Jump Room program were Hughes Aircraft of El Segundo, California, Parsons Corporation, the former Ralph M. Parsons Company of Pasadena, California, and Lockheed Skunk Works of Burbank, California. Of that, I am absolutely certain.
Mike Kruger, how many hours in a day on Mars?
Just a little bit beyond ours, just minutes beyond Earth time. So we knew that we could pretty much track time so that when dusk was falling there, it was similar to dusk on our planet in terms of how much time we'd spent on the surface. Mars just has a slightly longer day than Earth.
Ward Alien Video would like to know who the next president is.
I don't know. I was told of that when I had lunch with the Bushes, both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, that they were future presidents. When we had dinner with William Jefferson Clinton, Bill Clinton, I was privy to the discussion with him about his future service. And when Barack Obama and I were serving in the Mars Jump Room program, my father and others were describing both of us as future presidents. I don't know if I'm going to reach the presidency. You know, over the last year or so, I've been battling vision problems that hopefully I will be delivered from through the good graces of my phenomenally talented surgeons in California. But I was told that I was a future president. I don't know if I'm going to reach it. I might, I might not. But also, I know that my father knew that Donald Trump was a future president, as revealed in my June 2016 interview with Alfred Webre.
That's 5 consecutive presidents you mentioned, from literally 2018 to or 1988 to the present, from George H.W. Bush through Clinton to Bush Jr. to Obama and now Trump.
Yes, those 5 presidents were known to me as future American presidents. And in fact, Barack and I were only, teenagers. And my father told me that Barack reaches the presidency in his late 40s, and you reach the presidency in your 60s. And I made it clear when I ran for president in 2016 that I did not expect to win. I had no money at first, no party, no organization. I ended up collecting about only $20,000 in donations. I ran with a housewife from Charlotte, North Carolina, named Karen Kinnison, who's also a very talented writer and editor, professional writer and editor. And despite the fact that we gathered only $20,000 in donations and were listed on only 20 state, I can't say ballots because we were write-in candidates, but we're qualified to be write-in candidates in about 20 states, we still got about 20,000 votes. I'm quite proud of that. But what we didn't have is what Donald Trump had, and that was money.
Yeah.
If I had had as much money as Trump, we were so successful in parlaying the 20,000 we raised into as many votes that we may have won. But I said at the time, look, I'm just running for president to learn the ropes. There have been many American presidents who have lost federal elections before being elected to the presidency. 2 that I can think of are Abraham Lincoln, who lost the Senate race in Illinois to Stephen Douglas 2 years before he was elected president of the United States. That was the 1858 election, prior to his election as president in 1860. And then was also Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas and president of the United States. What did he lose? He lost his first election for Congress from Little Rock. So when one loses a political election, it doesn't mean that one will not serve later in life at the state or federal level after being elected. And that's what I plan to do if my vision is up to it.
And since Obama, clearly a campaign that's successful needs at least $1 billion these days, which is a huge number for a lot of people need to be donating. That's why I think one of those 2 major parties needs to be behind you. But that's another conversation for another time. Let me get back to these questions here. Again, this is from One Stone or Two Cats. Was Sandia Labs in New Mexico involved in the space program at all?
It was involved in the time-space program. The return teleport that we would use to jump back to New Jersey was at Sandia. In fact, when I contacted Harold M. Agnew, the former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratories, in 2000, and I describe this in my upcoming book, Once Upon a Time in the Time Stream, Harold told me, look, Andy, you're mixed up. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, the teleporter wasn't at Lano. It was at another one of the atomic research labs in New Mexico, so keep on looking. Well, of course, that was accurate. It was at Sandia. So Sandia was involved in the time-space program. The teleport was actually in the building, but I don't know of any connection between Sandia and the Mars Jump Room program.
This is Fartukov. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm assuming this is an international listener, as I see some other international names. Is there any way that any of this is provable?
Yes. Under the laws of the United States, first of all, when you experience something or you see something and you talk about it, that is considered not hearsay, but direct evidence. Now, when you allege that you have certain experiences and others corroborate you, not by making similar claims, but by saying, I can place Andrew D. Basiago, or I can place William B. Stillings, or I can place Bernard Mendez, or I can place William Whitecrow, or I can place Ken Johnston Sr. in this location doing this, that's admissible. In fact, it's on that basis that people can get convicted, for example, of robbing a bank. If you say, yes, that man at the defense table is the man I saw robbing the bank, that is entirely admissible and, in fact, makes up a lot of the evidence in felony and misdemeanor prosecutions in the United States. Okay, so first of all, I brought forward fellow jumpers. Second of all, I identified the technology as aeronautical repositioning chambers before the great-granddaughter of a president, Laura Eisenhower, my dear friend Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower, came forward and revealed that she was invited to relocate on Mars in 2006 and 2007 with her two then 10-year-old sons, Gavin and Garrick Eisenhower, and she was told that she would be going back and forth between Earth and Mars via arc. Now, Laura did not know that we knew that the defense technical term for the jump rooms was aeronautical repositioning chamber. So that was corroboration on the level of very esoteric information. Third, there was the testimony of all five of us. We all came forward, including William Whitecrow, who could have lost, if William Whitecrow was lying, he could have lost his military pension, and even for revealing the truth, he could have been prosecuted under JANEP 146E and subjected to 10 years of imprisonment at Leavenworth State Prison in Kansas, a $10,000 fine, and loss of his military pension. So I'm really saddened by the loss of William Whitecrow in February of 2018, because he really was a phenomenally important witness and truth teller about the fact that the other four of us were in the Mars Jump Room program with him. And we miss his passing, and we celebrate his legacy. It was profound. He had everything to lose by coming forward. So we came forward with each other, and then the Howard Hughes connection has been corroborated not just by my memories and those of William Whitecrow when he was still alive, but have been verified by Major General Mark Music, a retired U.S. Army general. I believe he was in the Army. I've never really asked him. But Major General Mark Music and his co-author Douglas Wellman, a former dean of students at the University of Southern California, have written a brilliant and important work entitled Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes, that in my view absolutely proves that Howard Hughes lived until 2001. And I was able to share with them, as was Whitecrow, our memory of interacting with Howard Hughes on the fourth floor of the El Segundo jump room site. So this is corroboration. It is a level of factual correspondence that is so esoteric and so impossible to fabricate that it has to be the truth. And I would distinguish that from mere claims. They have to be interlocking claims. They have to be verified by others. You have to remember who you served with. You have to describe experiences that you had with other experiencers. you have to interview them live on stage, as I did with Stillings and Mendez, so that the audience knew that there was no way we were making it up. I was interviewing them just as I would a witness in a criminal trial. And I was applying 20 years of experience as an attorney at that point to do so. So, yes, that is the proof. Proof that would be admissible in any court of law in the United States to get somebody convicted of a felony is the standard of proof that I met for my claims and those of my fellows about the Mars Jump Room program.
And we both know that for crimes, the standard of proof is a lot higher as opposed to civil litigation.
Exactly. I was referring to the beyond the reasonable doubt standard.
Exactly.
I believe that the inundation of information we got when we linked together those 7 jumpers, Ralph, Neumann, Basiago, Stillings, Mendez, White Crow, Johnston, I believe that we together provided information beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, I am somewhat disturbed about what's happened to that thread of Mars Jump Room claimants. We lost William Whitecrow last year, as I mentioned. Bernard Mendez has been ill, living in New Jersey with his sister. Ralph, Neumann, and Stillings no longer seem interested in coming forward on television, radio, or live appearances. And that leaves, as I've had a number of discussions recently with Ken Johnston and I, that really leaves Ken Johnston and I standing. But we have agreed to continue to stand in our truth because we think the American people have a right to know that U.S. astronauts were on not just the moon, but Mars.
I would love if you were able to appear with Ken in the future. That would be great to have him on with you at the same time on this show.
I would love to do that. I did appear in Mars 6 with him when it was still in Mobile, Alabama. It's now moved to Silver City, New Mexico, and possibly Albuquerque. But yes, I've appeared with Ken, and we have absolutely corroborated meeting each other once on the surface when he was piloting the Sky Taxi, and he picked up William Whitecrow and I to protect our lives.
This is a direct plea, or not plea, to something for me to say to Mr. Pritchard out there. He says, I can't see the questions pop up when you type them in caps, but I can see them, Mr. Pritchard, so please continue to write your questions in caps. Now, Michael Wise, before I get to his question that's in caps, if I recall, his earlier question was about Yellow Book. He wanted to know, what did the Yellow Book say about the origins of the universe?
I don't know. I do know this. One of the things we were taught on Project Pegasus was that after that solar system catastrophe, civilization on Earth went sideways for about 6,500 years. Remember how Otzi, the Italian Iceman, was found through genetic studies to have lived 5,500 years ago?
Yes.
And yet he had 40 tools on him? Different things. He had not only spear points and arrowhead points, but he had lichen to stem infections and things like that. He had 40 tools on him, fishing hooks and so forth. Okay. He was a survivor of that civilization dressed in what? In skins. So that was the caveman period of our Cro-Magnon ancestors. They were descendants of the High Egyptian civilization that was destroyed by the solar system catastrophe. And we were told during our Yellow Book lessons at that SO night school in Convent Station, New Jersey, that it was the small grays that kick-started our civilization in ancient Sumer, 3000 BC. So that's why, for example, the Masonic and the Hebraic dating system for the world is only 5,000, 5,500 years. That's not the world. That's not the Earth. That was the history of civilization being kick-started in 3000 BC by the small grays in ancient Sumer. That's why we were also taught that that's why we call summer Sumer and Sumer summer. You know, the summer is the most pleasant season in the northern hemisphere. We call it summer because ancient Sumer was the golden age of civilization. We got our civilization back. The small grays taught us writing, their language was the basis for the Akkadian language of ancient Sumer. It was the basis for the Astart alphabet that we then had to learn on Pegasus, which is derived by NASA from ancient Sumerian text, the so-called Akkadian script. And so they also taught us mathematics, which is critical to engineering and science and technical development.
And astronomy.
So indeed. And so our current civilization is only about 5,000 years old, and look at where we've gone.
Especially
we've gone to
the
the
last
stars already.
150 years, a phenomenal leap.
Absolutely. It began J-curving, let's say, around 1920, and we've been gone off the charts now in terms of where we were. I mean, even the 1900 that I visited New York City in 1905, 1907 timeframe, and there was horse manure on the streets that was defecating. So we don't even appreciate how just in the last century we really cleaned up our act and we created a much nicer life for people. Longer lifespans, better nutrition, better medicine. We've really come a long way as a country. And because I love my country, because I'm a patriotic American who served my country in 2 4-year classified defense projects, I want this truth to be known. We have a right to know, I think as part of the common heritage of mankind, that our countrymen and women reached the red planet. You know, at the time that they were lauding Sally Ride for being the first woman on the space shuttle,
yes,
American women like Regina Elvira Dugan, who would later be appointed director of DARPA, like Laura Eisenhower's aunt Mary Jean Eisenhower, were on the surface of Mars. I think that should be told. What a great inspiration that is, not only to young men, but young women. We've already been on another planet. That story deserves to be told. And that's why we'll continue to speak out about the Mars Jump Room program.
This is the other part of Michael Wise's question that I'm able to read word for word. Many amateur astronomers are showing tons of cities on the moon and other activity. What do you know of this?
I was never on the moon. I'm familiar with some of the anomaly data because my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, has included brilliant anomalists like Brett Collins Shepard and Ross Curley and Louis Michael Reinhardt and Martine Graney, who have sometimes turned their attention, as I haven't, to the moon. What I know, also from the work of Tim Huckabee, who's known as the writer Tim Cohen, that some of the objects on the moon that were photographed alongside the Apollo astronauts were not rocks. They were fossils of large dinosaur-like creatures. So in the doctoring of the data from the 12 Americans who landed on the moon, some of the cover-up was altering the photographs to conceal the fact that these were not rocks. They were fossils of animals. Also, I would cite the fact that Brett Collins Shepard found lunarians. He found images of these bullet head-shaped creatures that were very much like H.R. Geiger's old drawings for Omni magazine, and they were present on the moon. There are huge artifacts there. My friend Tanya Maidenford made a short feature about an object on the moon that is about 4.5 miles high. So yes, there are different artifacts on the moon, and that's been part of the lunar cover-up, is that human beings from Earth reached the moon in antiquity. But as I said, not just the moon. They reached Mars, the moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, and the moon of Jupiter called Iapetus, and the moon of Saturn called Enceladus or Enceladus. So we were out there. So in that sense, the lunar probes by Apollo were a return to the moon, just as the Mars Jump Room program was a return to Mars by individuals, many of whom had some of the ancestry, some of the genetics of the Martian civilization when it was in a confederation with Earth. So that's really what's been concealed by NASA. They tried to depict Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo as the modern space programs that went to the moon, as if it had never been gone to before, but in fact, it was concealing a much larger deployment of American astronauts who were going back to these moons and planets as human beings from Earth, because we had done so extensively in antiquity, and the evidence is there.
I'm glad
and that's the evidence we're trying to release through the Mars Anomaly Research Society, is look at the incredible things that we're finding up there.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned Saturn's moons, and the next question comes up regarding that. And let me just say this for all the folks out there and for you, Mr. Basiago, that since we did start a few minutes late, if you don't mind, we'll go a few minutes after so we can catch up with some of these questions. So here's Nicholas.
Not at all. Take as long as you would like.
Okay, excellent. Nicholas Cashmore. Is there life, or was there life, on the 9th moon of Saturn per the Dogon tribe knowledge?
There could have been. All I can say about Saturn is that I think it's called Enceladus. There's one that has a humanoid face that is about a third of the surface of the planet. So I would say yes. I think the Dogon story could very well be a connection between the planet Sirius and one of those African civilizations, yes. But I'm not an expert on everything. I only talk about what I know.
Now, this is from 760 to 400. What physical anomalies did you experience immediately after jumping?
Physical anomalies? Well, one thing that was kind of strange was if we compared the fact that that Mars is only 40% the size of Earth, if we assume that both planets have interiors that are more solid than hollow, at a differential of 1/2.5, right? When we as adult male humans from Earth took a stride on Earth, it was 3 feet, right, or 3 or 4 feet. So, at a differential of 2.5 or 1/2.5 on Mars, we should have been able to stride and leap about 7 or 8 feet with one stride, but we weren't able to do so. There was a slight elevation of our feet, but it was more like going about 4 or 4.5 feet. So what I've speculated is that this indicates that either one or both of the planets is primarily hollow. And of course, the work of the brilliant friend of mine, Dr. Brooks Agnew, you can find 5 hours of material about his inner Earth studies, indicates that a lot of the Earth actually is hollow. And I think that Mars was also, because one day when we were up there, when Bernard Mendez and Barack Obama and I were digging, we reached at about 12 feet a kind of a thick metal rim, kind of like a 4-inch metallic planetoid-type like surface beneath the Earth of Mars. So I think the answer for the reason we couldn't stride as much as we should have been able to, based on gravitational forces that would obtain with a Mars that was only 40% the size of Earth, and hence should have allowed us to leap at least 3 times farther with each footstep, was the fact that Earth and Mars are largely hollow. So it was more like, it wasn't the difference between, let's say, a cantaloupe and an orange. It was more like the difference between a cantaloupe peel and an orange peel, and therefore there was less gravitational differential than there should have been.
Lasha Senyak, this is a comment, says she saw that in remote viewing on Mars, people jumping like that when trying to walk. So this is exactly what you just mentioned. I thought I should say that comment to you. Okay, Mr. Pritchard, finally, his question in caps says, does Elon Musk have insider knowledge about Mars, and is he involved in the programs?
I don't know. I certainly have a lot of respect for Elon Musk. He's a brilliant industrialist. I think his Tesla car shows fascinating imagination of where automotive transport could go. and I think it's important that it's battery-powered and not powered by gasoline, at least all the time. But Elon has made a number of statements and really positioned his attempt to create a Mars program for civilians by stating that these will be the first humans on Mars, and that just is not the case. As I said, not only was Mars visited in antiquity by our distant ancestors from the high Egyptian civilization, but it was at any one time being visited by 1,500 American astronauts. At least that was the figure given to me by the late William Whitecrow before his death on February 16th of last year. So I'm sorry, but I do not believe that those who go with Elon Musk, if they do land on the surface of Mars, will be the first humans from Earth there. Nor do I even believe that those of us who as American astronauts went there were the first humans. We were just the first humans in this epoch of civilization to go. But we did go, so Elon is either mistaken or has been asked to promote the idea that we still haven't gone to Mars.
Well said.
I don't know which.
Let me remind everybody out there in the chat, if you could please copy and paste your questions, the older questions that you were writing in the first hour before we started taking questions to Mr. Basiago. That way I could see them so I could ask them. Otherwise, when I finish these final ones, then I will have to go, unfortunately. So, Hadley Scott McIntyre, there's two questions. First, will we ever get our chance to be like Major Matt Mason? I don't know if you know who that is, but I don't know.
I don't know who that is, but I do think that space exploration will become more standardized over the next 2 generations, yes.
The other question from Hadley Scott McIntyre, do you eat first before you jump?
We were doing very little eating, and for that matter, very little relieving of our biological functions on the surface. We were eating before we went. There was an issue involving taking water. We were getting incredibly dehydrated by the jump rooms. And I remember one time that William Stillings brought a bottle of bottled water, and yet when we landed on the surface, about 60% of it was gone. So there was some sort of artificial evapotranspiration that was occurring. So we were really, really dehydrated. In fact, I not only experienced dehydration to this day, but I have been found to be dehydrated and have been drinking lemon ginger tea constantly over the last year just to rehydrate my body. I mean, in other words, as the brother of a brilliant American physician and one lucky to have the extremely talented doctors that I have, I was found to be literally dehydrated. And I think that began during the Mars Jump Room program because we were being really incredibly dehydrated when we would land on the surface as a result of the jump room technology.
Now I'm going back in older to see if I could find the older questions, which are definitely there. So I'm pleading again to people, please, if you could please copy and paste them again. That way I could ask them this show. All right, let's see here. Lasha Senyuk, I've always wondered, has Basiago ever wondered if these memories were placed in him by the military as a kind of experiment or even a false flag type operation?
No, that was disproven quickly in my search for the truth. So, for example, when I started not remembering, but just revisiting, I always remembered them, my childhood time travel experiences in Project Pegasus. I worked through a very brilliant social psychologist named Jean Maria Arrigo. Jeannie connected me to Captain Ernest Garcia. He is a real person, not just somebody named Garcia. Okay, now Captain Garcia, who I think was a major when I was on the project, an oral history has been done of him by the University of California at Berkeley. He's a real person. He remembered my father and I on the program. I then went out and found evidence of the teleporters in New Jersey by interviewing Captain Louis B. Webre, who was a professional engineer who had seen the technology when he was working on one of our nuclear submarines at Curtiss-Wright in the 70s. In other words, no. Certainly, when I first began thinking about my experiences as an American lawyer, I was required to police myself for any kind of psychiatric issue. But quickly in my investigation, I proved that my time travel experiences were real. I got confirming evidence from Harold Agnew, the director of the Los Alamos National Labs, Joseph Conason of Parsons. My own father and Courtney Hunt had given me information, and we had talked about my experiences in the time travel program, and others. And you'll see these accounts in my upcoming book, Once Upon a Time in the Time Stream. Now, when I began to access my memories of the Mars Jump Room program in 2010 and after, once I began talking to other experiencers and we were sure of our training and our experiences on the surface, no, I was able to readily discount the possibility that we had implantation of memory. In fact, we had the opposite. We had the blocking of memory, and that's why it took us so many years to break through and remember what we did. I mean, I went to the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, between 1980 and 84, and I spent about half my time driving over to El Segundo and jumping to Mars. I mean, I did earn my degree, but in the case of the Columbia degree that was offered to Barack Obama and I, Barack took that lead and transferred from the school that he was at.
Here in California, yeah, the Los Angeles school. If I don't recall the name off the top of my head,
I'm blanking on it
too. Yeah.
But transferred from that college,
Occidental
College,
yes,
to Columbia, and I didn't. Okay, and so even the history of Obama is tied up in the Jump Room program, and I confirmed, for example, with my friend Eva M. Thompson, who was then attending UCLA, that she remembered me talking about it, that I was going to Mars. There were discussions between my mother, in one instance, and a co-ed at UCLA as to why there was red dust on my boots. So we really went, and even though it's an intelligent question to ask, whether or not such far-out memories, such tall drinks of water, if you will, were implanted by the government, I spent years. I've spent 20 years investigating my time travel experiences, and now 9 years investigating my Mars Jump Room experiences, and we've confirmed that they existed. And really the issue, as I said, was that they blocked our memories, not that they implanted them.
Here's an interesting comment I thought you should hear from Nicholas Cashmore. He says, Andrew Basiago for president, with an exclamation point. I thought you should definitely hear that. Okay.
Well, thank you for that.
Michael Wise asks, what else do you know about bismuth? The ancient alchemists used bismuth when preparing the mercury.
I know categorically that my father stated that the chronovisor images were being driven just by putting an EM signal through an 8-sided bismuth crystal. In fact, there was an individual named Keach in the United Kingdom who found the prominent solid-state physicist originally from Japan, Leo Asaki's 1967 patent involving 8-sided bismuth crystals, and guess who was listed in the first entry in the prior works list of that U.S. patent as granted? My father.
Huh.
The patent that my father, Neil Williams of the Edison Labs, earned in 1962 for their work on bismuth crystals. They had developed an improvement on the Hall plate, which was a way to create a perfectly spaced electrical lead, so there was no signal to noise, signal to ground noise, so-called Johnson noise or white noise in electrical leads when they were building the sensors for our time travel program, is they needed to be able to detect where we were in different dimensions. Okay, that 1962 patent that my father and Neil T. Williams were granted was cited in Asaki's 1967 patent involving, guess what again? Bismuth crystals. So I'm absolutely certain that bismuth crystals played a critical role in the chronovisors. And then when my friend Jer Rivera installed them in his Rasha scalar healing device, he began to have really incredible results. And I would recommend that device to anybody. It's a phenomenal healing device. He, in fact, unstuck one of my heart valves. Jer Rivera, I thank you, my friend, my colleague, because you saved my life by opening up my heart valves when it was stuck. We heard the opening of that heart valve in the room when he was running the Rasha device to heal the heart, that was good for the heart. And it went pop, and I felt the vibration in my chest. So those are some of the applications of Bismuth that I'm aware of. They were applied in the chronovisors that Project Pegasus was using, and they proved very interesting when Jer Rivera de Genio then put them in the Rasha scalar healing device.
This other question is also from Michael Wise. Do you believe William Tompkins was correct about a youth serum program for the elite and astronauts?
A what type of program for the
youth? Y-O-T-H.
Well, yes.
Y-O-U-T-H, sorry.
William Tompkins,
yes.
Who was interviewed by Michael Salla. Yes, I met him towards the end of his life. In fact, a month before his death at age 93. He told me that he remembered my father, and that, in fact, my father had headed a commission inside the U.S. intelligence community to convince the rest of the intelligence community that time travel had been developed, because they didn't believe it, and hence they were discounting the information that we were gathering via quantum access. But yes, I think William Tompkins was a truth teller, and like Dr. Michael Salla, I believed his account of having contact with the Nordics when he was working at Douglas Aircraft. I found that entirely convincing, as delivered at the 2017 MUFON Symposium in Las Vegas, where I had the privilege of appearing with William Tompkins on a panel discussion. I believe that he was a truth teller, and I can't confirm, but I believe that his entire account of having contact with the Nordics at Douglas Aircraft was true. And I think what it revealed was that after World War II, the reptilians sided with the Nazis, and the Nordics came in to help the Allied forces, including the United States, and they won, thank God. But yes, I view William Tompkins as a truth teller.
I'm glad you mentioned the alliance, because that's another thing that Dr. Michael Salla is a great friend of mine. As a matter of fact, when I'll be in Hawaii, I'll be spending time with him. He's been on the show multiple times over the last almost 7 years. Great guy. So it's fantastic
Absolutely.
that you go along with know him and have interviewed with him. Okay, Ward Alien Video wants to know if you did ever jump from Woodbridge or Woodbridge, New Jersey. He says he lives near Woodbridge.
It wasn't Woodbridge, which is just a single word name for a place name in New Jersey. It was Woodridge, New Jersey. The Curtis Wright was at 1 Passaic Avenue, Woodridge, New Jersey. So no, I don't believe I was ever in Woodbridge, but we were jumping to New Mexico from a teleporter in Building 68 at the Curtis Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey.
This is Mr. Pritchard again. Now I'm going back in time to the older questions. When they change timelines, do they instantly create a second version of the universe? If so, where would that second version exist?
No, what we learned in the Chronovisor program is that there's a myriad of timelines. So we're on the timeline that we're on. And we go back and forward in time via chronovision. We study what existed on that timeline, on our timeline. But when they were first testing some of these devices, we were actually gathering information, such as that global coastal flooding event that we saw when we were sent forward to 2012. That didn't happen on this timeline. So I'm trying to think of the number. I think it was, if by one recent calculation, there are so many timelines in the omniverse or multiverse that if the number of those timelines was set in 12-point type, the number itself would stretch for 130 million miles. So the way to conceive the universe is not just with 10 or 11 dimensions, as Michio Kaku has described. We live in this dimension of 4 dimensions, or 5, if you add time. But surrounding us are a myriad of other timelines at different angles that we can only access using some of these quantum access technologies to get either past or future on our timeline or on other timelines. But there are so many of these timelines that while we live in a finite universe, it can be thought of as infinite. It is virtually infinite. I hope that helps.
Nicholas Cashmore, is it possible to astral travel to Mars to see it?
Certainly, astral travel is available to all of us when we're dreaming. And that, I think, may be informing some of the claims of those who believe they've been there. And I think it's important to study these experiences. One of the interesting things we found is that both on Project Pegasus and on the Mars Jump Room program, that there were individuals who remembered interacting with each other in the waking state, where the opposite party only confirmed interacting in the dream state. And the opposite occurred regarding the Mars Jump Room program. I had somebody come forward who talked about meeting me on Mars, and I thought initially that she couldn't be telling the truth because I left the Jump Room program in 1984, and this individual was born in 1984. But then when she started to share her memories with me, I was startled by the fact that I had dreamt those things. So there seems to be a third thing going on our planet that parapsychology and physics have not yet begun to discuss, much less map, and that is that it seems as if two people can have a common experience, that one lives in the waking state and one lives in the dream state. So we're really dealing with a multiplicity here of experiences. There were real experiencers who went, in the flesh and blood in the waking state. There are some who are lying, others who are deluded, some who may be new claimants who went up later, not via technology provided by the U.S. government, but by probes into outer space by private factions. And then there's this third category where something is going on multidimensionally, where people are having real experiences, but they're not grounded experiences like we experience in the waking state. It's almost as if there might be a third form of consciousness, not the waking state, not the dream state, but something like imagined real experience or real imagined experience. There's something else going on. So we really have to be discerning about which we're dealing with among those possibilities.
Redneck Grandpa wants to know, how do you lucid dream?
I'm not really a dream expert. I lucid dream just by talking to myself as I'm falling asleep. And I try to program myself to remember my dreams. That's a critical part of that.
HelidiumLabs.com wants to confirm the address. Is it 9900 Sepulveda?
The Mars Jump Room building, the West Coast Jump Room, was at 999 North Sepulveda. It was then owned and operated by Hughes Aircraft. It was not the headquarters building of Hughes Aircraft, which is deeper into El Segundo. It was just the owned and operated Hughes Aircraft building at 999 North Sepulveda and Imperial Avenue East and West. That is literally the street that borders the southern perimeter of the Los Angeles International Airport. That building, which has since been altered, the front or north wall has been stripped away, and there's this huge sort of decorative decoupage kind of thing hanging from it for some reason. That was done, I believe, in 2003. But that was the building that we were jumping to Mars through.
I could tell you they were not happy when we were filming in front of that little artist little type structure right in front of that building. I know for a fact, because security came to tell us that we can't film even though we were on public property on the sidewalk.
Now why would that be in a Los Angeles office building that just has commercial contractors in it today. I would also add that my friend, the brilliant filmmaker Frank Jacobs of Canada, he went up to the 7th floor, right below the floor we were jumping to Mars to back in the day, and he was approached by 4 security guards who questioned him. He told them he was filming a Rock TV video, when in fact he was filming the footage for what became his film Packing for Mars. And Frank was directed out of the building by 4 security agents. Now, how often does that happen in just some innocent commercial office place in Los Angeles? It doesn't happen.
Doesn't unless they're hiding something major, and obviously that's the major thing too. That's why we're talking about it. Let me give a shout out to Nicholas Cashmore for his super chat right now. The CA $7.77. I appreciate that. Okay, this is from Rolf Pfeiffer Muller. It's best if I just read exactly what he read to understand the question. He says, Dr. J, ask this gentleman about his eyes vision issue, probably a type of scalar wave / frequency emissions to silence him. Also, is he running for president in the coming years?
Well, I'll be real frank about my eye issue. When I was running for president the first and only time in 2016, immediately after writing my 100 proposals, a new agenda for a new America, I began to get floaters in the vitreous humor of my eye, and they began to accumulate. Now, I had a diabetes-like syndrome before that. I had been warned about that fact by Jack Pruitt of Project Pegasus as early as summer of 2003, and I read about that in my new book, Once Upon a Time in the Time Stream. Okay, then I was diagnosed as having diabetic retinopathy with macular degeneration, but it came on after my diabetes was under control. So in other words, in 2016, 17, 18, and 19, I had hemoglobin A1C readings as low as in the 5s, which is actually more support for the notion that I was hypoglycemic, okay? So then when when the election ended, and I returned to Washington State to practice law, I was walking every day up 164th Avenue in Vancouver, Washington, and my vision began to decline. So 2 blocks away from a street corner, I would see like a fog, and then that fog got closer and closer and closer. So the official allopathic diagnosis for what happened to my eyes was not as a result of being targeted. The opinion of the allopathic ophthalmologists who have studied my eyes is that I had diabetic retinopathy with macular degeneration. And I've so far had two operations called triectomies, or trifectomies. Vitrectomies. I always get that wrong. Vitrectomies to remove my vitreous humor and clean out the scarring, which is blood and protein, in front of my retinas. One of the things I learned is that as we age, the gelatinous quality of our vitreous humor declines, and we start to get material in it, including blood, protein, foreign objects, and so forth. I had a lot because I had to lay there for 3 hours in twilight sleep state while they put this pipette-like device into my vitreous humor to remove much of it, and with it the blood and proteins in my eyes. I now have to be treated. I haven't had the surgery yet, but I will then get cataracts treatment with laser, and then I'll get a lens replacement. So it has been alleged, however, by other doctors, one MD that I saw in Malaysia, that what she saw in my eyes was as a result of targeting. I don't know whether scalar weapons were used or any kind of weapon was used to target my vision, but I think it is an intelligent surmise that this caller makes to explore or at least question the possibility, was there an attempt to silence me by blinding me because of the power of my 100 proposals and the fact that I had actually served in Pegasus in the Mars Jump Room program, and they didn't want to release the truth of time travel or of Mars visitation to the American public. Bear in mind, for example, that even though I was ignored by American TV networks, I was interviewed by the BBC during the campaign. So I think it's a matter of conjecture. I'm not sure that it matters. Either diabetes or this diabetes-like syndrome caught up with me and damaged my eyes, because bear in mind, diabetes ravages the eyes, the heart, and the kidneys. This is one reason I'm going to be speaking out about the fact that we're now only identifying 50% of American diabetics. To rescue those fellow Americans from blindness, heart disease, and kidney failure, we need to make testing for diabetes the same kind of mission, the same kind of cause we made when we popularized the health effects of cigarettes. We need to have fasting blood glucose testing becoming the trendy thing to do if we're going to prevent our number of blind in America from going from 1.5 million to 6 million Americans if we don't start interdicting them and treating them for diabetes. So it may have been diabetes. It may have been targeting. I don't know. It doesn't matter. All I know is that my surgeons are so talented that they're beginning to bring back my vision, at least in my right eye. So yes, I think I may have been targeted, but I don't know, and I kind of am a little bit cautious about the psychology of targeting because it makes us ignore some of these conventional health threats that we are still not on top of as a country, and we need to be to rescue some of these, to rescue so many Americans from these serious health effects.
Before I ask this next question, this is coming from me myself, and what me and you were speaking about a few days ago about how the other astronauts were offered homes in Dallas. And I would think because of any medical conditions that would arise from what you did, just like the same way veterans have the Veterans Affairs and always have medical care, I would think that they would provide you with the same, just like they provided astronauts with homes and veterans with health care.
The CIA lied to us. We were cheated. We were told that they would, after our jump room, or even during our jump room service, they would give us zero-interest home loans to buy residences in the Redding, California area, because that area around Mount Shasta had been selected, just as it had been selected for our training at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California, which is literally on the volcanic apron of Mount Shasta, that area would be to the Mars Jump Room program what Houston and Galveston Bay and so forth were to the conventional space program. The second thing that they promised us was the revolving door of government service after we served. Well, some of those in my training group got that. I mean, Barack Obama reached the Senate and the presidency. Regina Dugan was appointed the director of DARPA. And Willie McCool, of course, was one of the space shuttle astronauts. Sadly, he died on February 1st of 2003 in the space shuttle Columbia disaster upon re-entering into Earth's atmosphere. Okay, the other that I know, for example, myself, Stillings, and Mendez, we were cheated of all of that. And because the program was secret, we were not given any proof of having served in the military, or at least being shadow listed at that time as military officers. We were not given any salary except for a couple of very small checks that were sent to William Stillings and I for like $34 or $55, not from the Office of Naval Intelligence, but the Department of Naval Intelligence. And the only place we have ever found that term of art for a U.S. agency was in the account of Robert Lazar.
Yes.
He had some contact with the Department of Naval Intelligence. Okay, so we were given no significant salary of any kind. We were not covered under the GI Bill of Rights, even though we were medically and psychologically impacted by our service. And indeed, my current battle with blindness may have been caused by that program or the combined effects of the devices I was exposed to in Project Pegasus in childhood between 1968 and 72, and then the devices I was exposed to in Los Angeles to go to Mars from 1981 to 84. So that's 7-8 years of government service in which we received, in my case, I received no coverage under the GI Bill of Rights, when in fact the impacts may now be coming home to roost. So yes, this is an injustice that is un-American. Could you imagine any of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts doing the initial feats in space that they did and not being paid or not being covered under the GI Bill of Rights? Except for Harris and Schmidt, they were, after all military officers. So this is something we have to rectify. Let me also say this. When individuals come along and are guided by either intentional lying or by delusion or fantasy, bear in mind they are crowding the field with convoluted and unreal information. I know, for example, that one of the claimed Mars experiencers drew his description of the two predators on the surface from drawings on the internet from the realm of science fiction fantasy that have been on the internet for 20 years. Again, I don't want to name names, but I just want to remind those who are not telling the truth, look, you are saturating the field so that the truth that the Mars jumpers brought is being confused and to some extent relegated to the side, when in fact we were building the case so that we could be paid, because some of us have medical and psychological consequences. William Whitecrow is dead. Bernard Mendez is sick. William Stillings has neurological issues. And I have been battling blindness, heart disease, and kidney disease. And I think if the good Lord's willing, I'm going to be able to overcome those problems. But this is serious medical impacts.
Yeah.
So please tell the truth. Please work with your memories to see if there's any inconsistencies. Please come forward if you're lying and acknowledge that you were lying. Please explore your memories and see whether you were inspired by what you heard, not what you did. Because this is what we've been trying to accomplish. Bring this information forward so that the American people know the truth about their space program, so that those who exercise the valor of going millions of miles to Mars can be historically credited for having done so that we can be issued our medals, hopefully by President Trump or a later president, and so that, most importantly, we can finally be covered for our medical and psychological impacts under the GI Bill of Rights, because that is a proper application, I believe, of the Bill of Rights, the GI Bill.
It is. It very well is. And, like you said, hopefully the more we keep this open and the more truth that comes out, that you will get what you were told you were supposed to get back then. And it's a travesty that 35 plus years later, you still are fighting basically an uphill battle. So definitely my hat's off to you. Now, here's a question, and before I ask it, I just want to let you know that there's a lot of people that have sort of answered this question in the chat, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. This comes from Redneck Grandpa. How do you open your third eye?
Again, I'm not a psychic expert, but we certainly were able to open up our third eye just by practicing remote viewing. Your right eye is your pineal gland, so certainly you can stimulate the pineal gland and try to eliminate the calcification of it as you age. That's one of the reasons why children are so psychic, because they have a fresh pineal gland, and it is known to calcify. So you can watch your calcium intake, and you can also stimulate it electromagnetically and with warm water massage and with physical massage with your hands or somebody else's to try to open up that pineal gland. That's the third eye.
I'm glad you actually mentioned that because that's exactly what I've always been taught too. That gland is in fact your third eye, and it does calcify. And I'm glad you also addressed the fact that children are more clean as far as not being calcified because ETs have a tendency to be attracted to children because of that, because their bodies are not polluted.
Yes, and children are also able to see things that they don't know doesn't exist. Up until age 7, children are having all kinds of contact experiences with different entities in the multiverse. It's only when the critical faculty is imposed in their minds at age 7 and their brains begin wrinkling, so-called crenulation, and their brains begin dividing, that children are cut off from that more multidimensional experience that they have in childhood. You know, Dr. Ian Stevenson, of the late Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, he collected over 2,000 reports from children of particular past lives that they were absolutely cognizant of and described at length, even things that children should have no experience of. And he recorded those. That's a major work in parapsychology. And I was such a child. And that's why we have to respect the claims that children are making about seeing certain entities.
That's right.
Because they are very well off in doing so, because their brains are still open, and with it their pineal gland, so that their psychic ability is sometimes just off the charts. I mean, as a young child in Project Pegasus, I was once asked, "Okay, Andy, what's behind the wall?" And I said, one of those porcelain containers that my mom calls a vase. And they said, "Okay, Andy, what color is it?" And I said, that color she calls aquamarine. And they said, "How long is it?" I said, "Oh, about 12 inches tall." And that's exactly what was on the other side of the wall. So children have sometimes psychic ability that is so keen that it's almost tantamount to X-ray vision, seeing through a wall. They are definitely seeing through the wall, but not with their eyes, but with the pineal gland and the cerebrum. So it's something we should respect and do even more research on, because still children have a role to play in allowing us to map the multiverse. And I'm happy to have pioneered that as an American schoolchild.
Now, this is the final question because it won't let me go further back into the chat. So while I ask this, if there's anyone else who has any final questions this show, I would be more than happy to pass them off. Otherwise, if anybody who is not in the chat anymore, which I see there are a lot of people, then please save your questions for next time. Although I am fairly certain that Mr. Basiago has definitely covered almost everything that everyone has asked of him. Okay, here it goes. This is from Lasha Senyak. She says, there are lots of photos on the net of Mars where rocks look like animals or statues, and she wants to know what you think of those.
Well, there are many statues on the surface. There is certainly a connection to the high Egyptian civilization in the sense that some of the heads and faces have the conical headdress of the pharaohs. There also seems to be a comic theme. Some are cats, and you know, cats were regarded as sacred beings by the high Egyptians. So there is some celebration of cats on the surface. It's an interesting mix of very childish and rudimentary statues, and then some exquisite statues, exquisite as any statue on Earth. And I think that this is really going to be one of the great, quite frankly, one of the great parlor games of the next generation, is just looking at this stuff. I mean, while I still had good vision, I could not believe what my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, was finding in terms of just exquisite statues, but also comic statues worthy of Dr. Seuss. So it's a very variegated artistic landscape, and it is only in some places. It's not the whole surface of Mars. It's just in some places there's a concentration of artwork where they were either like creating an outdoor art gallery or perhaps creating signage to warn others about whether it was safe or unsafe in that particular area. But it really is fascinating because we have proven, again, that not only is there one face on Mars, but as I wrote in one of my articles for ProjectMars.net, which I certainly have to tend to pretty soon, there are 1,000 faces on Mars. That was their principal art form, and they litter the surface. Some of them, one of them was a face of a young child carved in like a black obsidian rock, with striations of pink and white and tan rock, and that was just an exquisite statue that I found in one of the images. So we're still finding things. I would certainly draw you to the attention not only of my own work, but that of anomalists like Martine Graney. Martine's contribution to Marsology has been historic as far as I'm concerned. I think she's found as much as I found and more. She's found incredible pieces of artwork on the surface. So keep an open mind because, as I said, we didn't go to Mars as human beings. We went back to Mars as human beings. Our distant ancestors were there, and it could very well be some of the artwork that they left that we're looking at. Certainly the pyramidal forms on the surface can be linked to the high Egyptian civilization. So those were probably built by our ancestors on Mars.
I'm glad you mentioned the pyramids. This is my own little take on this for a second because I had a Forbes.com scientist or astronomer on the show, and when I mentioned it, he said, "What pyramids?" And there's so many photos of them. I know a lot of people in the chat were kind of taken aback to that attitude. That just goes to show what the mainstream tries to cover up. Now, here's the question from Nicholas Cashmore, which I want to give another shout out for the super chat. Was there an ancient war on Mars?
I don't know. I do know that it's been claimed that there was even a nuclear explosion or explosions there. We know there was a solar system catastrophe in which debris from outer space came tumbling into our solar system and struck the Earth, our moon, and Mars. And Mars was devastated by that. It became, as I said, what Richard Hoagland has described it as, a big muddy wasteland for the most part. But it didn't extinguish life on Mars. 30 major land animals survived, 2 humanoid species. They survived underground. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why the Homo martis terris are so muscular, and their muscular distribution on their skeletons is slightly different than men, for example, on Earth when they walked past me, because they were the descendants of the humans from Earth who dug their way out of that disaster. They are, in some cases, very strong, tall men. Not all of them. One of them was short and reminded me of Larry Neal of the Three Stooges.
Yeah. Yeah, Larry Fine.
He looked more like Larry Neal than Governor Jesse Ventura. But some of them are quite rugged, and that makes sense because they dug out of all that debris. Those were our ancestors' cousins or countrymen and women on the surface who were trapped there after the solar system catastrophe. And they've been breeding in isolation for 11,500 years, but based on genetic patterns on Earth, I think they could probably still interbreed with humans on Earth.
Well said. I'm looking through, like I said, I can't go even further back, and I'm not seeing anything new other than amazing comments for you. So with that being said, before I give you a thank you, if you have one final statement to say to everybody listening globally, what would it be?
It would be the theme that I've voiced in this interview, which is, look, we were American astronauts, but we were urged to not even think of ourselves as astronauts. We went not by a rocket, but via jump room. We don't know what that technology was based on. Yes, it was a CIA program, but it was in the defense contractors Hughes, Parsons, and Lockheed Skunk Works. The story of the actual survival of Howard Hughes until 2001, and the faking of his death in 1976 is a critical part of the story, because he, I believe, was the brainstorm behind the whole program. I met him 3 or 4 times in that building in El Segundo. So we have to bring this forward so that these individuals can be paid, benefited under the GI Bill of Rights. Yes, we weren't shot at, and I admire the men and women of the U.S. military who have put themselves in harm's way by risking being shot at or shelled. But we were in harm's way. We were at risk of being devoured on the surface of Mars by predators, and some of us did lose our lives. So we have to bring that forward. Now that we've lost so many of the claimants in the Mars jump room movement, and it's down to Ken Johnston and I beg that people understand that something unprecedented happened, a disclosure by 7 individuals being in the same program. And yet the field became an inspiration for something else. The true accounts then led to a new form of science fiction fantasy in which various individuals alleged they were in the so-called secret space program. But what was the secret space program? It was the real space program for which Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo were real, but also publicity, and they by single focus attention on those 3 programs. Okay, so there were hundreds and hundreds of Americans, British citizens and Soviet Russian citizens in the not in the same program, but on Mars at the same time. I ran into several teams of Britons, and I once crossed paths with a Russian team. So not just Americans, but citizens of the United Kingdom and the former USSR, now known as Russia, went to Mars. And while others can fantasize or make up false claims, and I certainly am practicing objectified open-mindedness so that new claimants can come forward who are telling the truth and be believed in a way that we were deprived the opportunity to be, the fact remains that the Mars jump room story involved an unprecedented number of claimants whose stories corroborated with high specificity and with actual knowledge of what's on Mars. As we begin to go back to Mars again, we'll be able to prove, probably, the existence of the Mars jump room program by finding the jump rooms, the jump room facilities. But until then, please be discerning on the one hand, and on the other hand, keep an open mind, because it was visited as early in this epoch as 1976. As I mentioned, I was going up between July of 1981 and May of 1984. Certainly there were others who may have followed, so I'm not discounting all claims, but I've already disproven several of the prominent claims being made. So if you are making false claims, please stop doing so. You know, again, I cited my example of writing for Jacques Cousteau, but I never sailed aboard the Calypso. I only stepped foot once on the Alcyone when they introduced that ship. So these things matter in terms of setting American history and world history right. The people have a right, I think, as part of the common heritage of humankind, to know what our civilization has done. And so I'm only sharing what I know. And I know that 4 of my comrades on Mars were Stillings, Mendez, White Crow, and Johnston. But I can't...
Andy, you still there?
Yes.
Oh, you just, after you said Johnston, you cut off for a quick second.
Yes, something's cutting off my phone. I don't know what it is.
I know, it sounds maybe someone's trying to interfere with it.
Yeah, I don't know what that was.
Anyhow, well, with that being said, I want to give you a big thank you for staying this extra time, almost 55 minutes past the show time, to ask these questions. I know people from all the comments that are being written are really intrigued both by what you say and are happy that someone is out there and sticking to their guns and telling the truth. So I want to thank you for joining me again on the show. We definitely will do this as much as we can. And let me give one big giant thank you to all the listeners and those of you in the chat. Remember, folks, the truth, disclosure, all of it is in your hands. Please be proactive. Please don't just take any claims from other people that don't have any evidence or are taking some sort of fiction or have a history of lying and then come about with some create fantasy and take it and believe it and run with it. Folks, it's all up to you. There are so much lies that are going around this planet, especially now with the technologies we have with the internet and things like that. This is why it takes people like Andy to come out and talk to you directly about what is the truth. His claims have never changed, and this is why I brought him back to the show, and also because all of you have asked him to be back. So with that being said, remember, the only thing about the show you have to remember is the name of it, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. Every single social media account is the same under that same name, at DRJ Radio Live. With that being said, this is Dr. J. Remember, folks, next week there will be no live shows as I will be in Hawaii. Join me again Monday, May 13th for the next live guest show. There might be some live streams from Hawaii. Until then, enjoy the archives. And let me give one more thank you to my guest, Mr. Andrew Basiago. Andy, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on, Dr. J, and I look forward to appearing with you again. And let me just make one last comment, and that is that I can understand why the late, great Art Bell was so devoted to the development of your career, because you're an excellent broadcaster. And I would just like to say that, Art, we miss you. You were a champion of the truth, and we will never see your like again. And we just celebrate the great life that you lived, and we miss you. But I'm sure that Dr. J will be providing the kind of great reporting that you did and is doing so. And I can see why you made the investment and put your faith in Dr. J. And I expect that to grow and develop over the future years into the same glorious career that you lived, Art. And so we miss you. And thank you, Dr. J, for doing what you do, just as Art did.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for that comment. And I don't think there's any better way to leave a show with that being said. So thank you all, and again, I'll see you all Monday.